Okay, so the next concept is telephony, and that is IP-based voice communication or voice over IP. So in the old days, we had a completely separate system for our phones. We had PBXs, or we had some type of infrastructure that was separate from our data and from our typical IP infrastructure. Nowadays, they are converged. So we have IP-based voice communication that we really should follow the same types of concepts and the same basic rules for segmentation and for security that we follow with our IP traffic, or our data traffic, I should say. It's susceptible to the same types of attacks and the same outages as computer traffic because, again, it's IP-based packets. So voice over IP traffic is more sensitive, however, to network fluctuations. So if we have a network that has some latency, some excess latency introduced, in other words, if we have a network that is very chatty, it's too large, right? As I talked about before, when we're in that large kind of cafeteria environment where we have too many people communicating at once, and that traffic kind of steps on each other, and then we have collisions. Then we have what's called latencies introduced because we have to back off that wire, wait a random amount of time, and then retransmit again. So you start to get stuttering and you start to drop packets. And that basically results in a degradation of service for our voice over IP infrastructure or for our voice over IP communications. So it's a good idea to separate that traffic out, to create its own separate VLAN. So in that case, we can now basically segment the traffic and give what's called QoS, or quality of service, that can be applied to that voice over IP traffic. In that fashion, or in that regard, we can make sure that, or tag those packets and say, hey, these voice over IP packets are of a higher quality or a higher priority than typical data packets. So as they pass through a router, make sure you give them priority. So that way it reduces latency in the network and it improves the quality of service. It gives you a better experience when you're communicating over that voice over IP network. And then additionally, it increases security because, again, we're segmenting that traffic off, or separating it out from the rest of our data traffic. Okay, next up is remote access and NAC, which deals with accessing corporate resources remotely. So what do I mean by that? Well, when we have the need for remote access, we're basically accessing corporate resources remotely because we have one of a few scenarios. We have telecommuters, basically people who are working from home, either consistently, or perhaps we want to give them that ability to maybe one day a week or one day a month, some type of perk so they don't necessarily have to travel into the office. We have road warriors that go out and either do sales from location to location, so they're constantly traveling to a new location, or we have branch locations that need access to our centrally located corporate resources. We also have VPN access that kind of goes hand in hand with that remote access capability. That is something they need to authenticate through either a Radius server or some type of authentication mechanism. Okay, so VPN we covered in more detail previously, but just understand that is kind of synonymous with accessing corporate resources from a remote location. And a couple of things that we can use with VPNs are two-factor authentication, such as a token, or it could even be fingerprint or biometric information, basically a password and something that you have or something that you know, okay, or something that you are. Okay, the three different things that basically can comprise some type of two-factor authentication. Okay, we can pick one of the two. What you know would be a password, what you have would be a token, and what you are would be like a retina scan or a fingerprint, things along those lines. Okay, so that additional component makes it a much more secure connection or a much more secure session. All right, so we also have network admission control or authentication control, depending on where you read. It can control and quarantine a workstation or a device until it's compliant. All right, so what does that actually mean? Well, in a NAC environment, network access control or network admission control, again, it varies depending upon what you read. It is basically the ability to quarantine a device until it meets a certain amount of, or a certain set of standards before you allow it on the network. All right, that could deal with antivirus, make sure that it's installed and up to date. It could be a certain patch level on the OS, or they have to have certain applications installed before you allow that device on your network. All right, so that comes into play when we have such things as the BYOD, or the bring your own device movement that's becoming more and more prevalent in the corporate environment. All right, so we have people that come in, maybe salespeople or vendors that would come on site. They have their own laptop. They want to access our network. Before we allow them to actually access any resources, we can quarantine them, a secure zone, so to speak, right? They plug a Cat5 cable or they connect wirelessly. They would immediately be placed into a DMZ or some type of quarantine, quote-unquote, zone. We'd have software that would scan their computer. Okay, they would basically accept those terms and conditions. It would scan their computer and say, hey, you need to either update your antivirus, or you don't have any antivirus, or maybe you don't have a specific application that we require on the network before you can access. And those resources are typically available to them within that secure zone, so they can download the latest patches or what have you. Or if they choose no, they obviously have that choice, but then they're not allowed on the network and they can't access corporate resources. Now, there are a few applications that kind of go hand in hand with this whole methodology as well, especially for mobile devices like smartphones, iPhones, Androids, and so on. Good Messaging, Mobile Iron, and AirWatch are three of the bigger vendors in that space, and they allow you to either take control of the entire device and push down applications and enforce policies to that device, or some of the more advanced ones can partition off a space of that device. So it allows a user to bring their own iPhone as an example, or their own Android device. It will partition off a piece of that so it's under a secure encrypted area of that phone that's used for corporate resources. So anything they download, any applications, email, etc., will stay in that secure position, or that's secure partition rather. So that way, if they lose the device or they leave the company, the administrator can securely wipe that partition without affecting the rest of the device. So that way their pictures and their personal information is not affected. So you basically have the ability to split that device between a personal and a corporate or a business use device.